The howl of the prairie wind carried Zachariah Blackwood's grief across the weathered crosses that dotted the small cemetery on the hill. 3 years had passed since he'd laid his beloved wife Abigail to rest, but to him, it might as well have been yesterday. Every Sunday, rain or shine, he stood at her grave with wildflowers clutched in his calloused hand, his shadow stretching long across the Wyoming soil that had claimed half his heart. "Brought your favorites today, Abby," Zach murmured, kneeling to place the purple prairie flowers at the base of the cross he'd carved himself. "The ranch is doing well enough. That new stallion is finally breaking in proper." His voice caught the same way it always did. "Miss you something fierce." The autumn of 1873 painted the landscape in hues of amber and gold, but Zach barely noticed. At 42, he had settled into his grief like an old coat familiar, heavy, but necessary against the cold reality of living alone. The nearby town of Pine Ridge had grown since he'd first settled here 15 years ago with Abigail, full of hope and dreams that seemed foolish now. He brushed his fingers against the engraved wood, remembering how they'd built the ranch together, how they'd planned for children that never came, how she'd died of fever before they could grow old together as promised. When he buried her, he buried his laughter too, his hope, his belief in second chances. The sound of hoofbeats pulled Zach from his reverie. Nobody came to this part of his land except him. He stood, shading his eyes against the setting sun, spotting a horse and rider moving too fast, listing dangerously in the saddle. His instincts kicked in before his mind could catch up. He was on his feet, running down the hill toward his own horse, tethered nearby. As he swung into the saddle, he could see the approaching rider was slumped forward, barely hanging on. "Whoa there," Zach called, spurring his horse forward. He reached the stranger just as they began to slip from the saddle. It was a woman. Blood stained her blouse, her face pale beneath streaks of dirt. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, deep brown, filled with pain and desperation before she lost consciousness completely. "Madam? Madam!" Zach caught her as she fell, easing her to the ground. The wound in her side was still seeping blood, and her skin burned with fever. Cursing under his breath, he tore a strip from his own shirt to bind the wound temporarily. "Hang on," he muttered, though he doubted she could hear him. With careful movements, he lifted her onto his horse, mounting behind her to keep her steady as he turned toward the ranch house. Zach hadn't expected company, not today, not any day, but as he cradled the unconscious woman against his chest, feeling the shallow rise and fall of her breathing, something long dormant stirred within him. Not hope, not yet. Just purpose. Someone needed him, and that was enough for now. The ride back to the ranch seemed longer than usual with the injured woman in his arms. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? What had happened? The wound looked like a bullet graze, which meant trouble. In these parts, people didn't get shot by accident. As the ranch house came into view, Zach allowed himself a small sigh of relief. The 2-story wooden structure stood as a testament to his and Abigail's dreams larger than a bachelor needed, with empty rooms that echoed with silence. He'd maintained it meticulously, unable to let go of what they'd built together, even as he lived in just a small portion of it. Almost there, he told the unconscious woman, though his words were more for his own comfort than hers. Once at the house, he dismounted carefully, keeping her steady before lifting her in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, fragile almost, though the calluses on her hands suggested she was no stranger to hard work. Inside, he laid her on the bed in the guest room, a room that hadn't seen use in years. The sheets were clean, though, thanks to his stubborn routine of keeping the entire house ready, as if Abigail might return to inspect his housekeeping. With gentle but efficient movements, Zach gathered what he needed: clean water, bandages, the whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes, and the healing salve Mrs. Peterson from town had given him after Abigail passed, claiming it would help with his heart. It hadn't, but it was good for wounds of the flesh, if not the soul. "This is gonna sting," he warned as he cleaned the wound. The bullet had carved a deep furrow along her side, but thankfully hadn't lodged inside. She stirred slightly at his ministrations, a soft moan escaping her lips, but didn't wake. Once the wound was clean, salved, and bandaged, Zach hesitated. Her clothes were dirty and blood-stained, but the propriety ingrained in him by his mother and reinforced by years of marriage made him uncomfortable with the idea of undressing an unconscious woman. He settled for removing her boots and covering her with a quilt. Then he pulled a chair beside the bed and settled in for what promised to be a long night. As the oil lamp cast dancing shadows across the room, Zach studied her face properly for the first time. She was younger than him, perhaps in her early 30s, with features that spoke of strength and determination even in repose. Her hair, a rich chestnut brown, was tied back in a practical braid that had partly come undone. "Who are you?" he whispered to the quiet room. "And what kind of trouble are you bringing to my door?" The night deepened around them, and still Zach kept watch, dozing occasionally, but never fully, surrendering to sleep. By dawn, her fever had risen alarmingly, and he found himself bathing her forehead with cool water, murmuring reassurances as she tossed restlessly. "Fight, madam," he urged when her breathing became labored. "Whatever you're running from, it ain't caught you yet." As morning light filtered through the curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, the woman's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, confusion clouded her gaze, then stark fear. "Easy now," Zach said, keeping his voice low and steady, the same tone he used with spooked horses. "You're safe. You're at Blackwood Ranch." She tried to sit up, wincing in pain. "How? You were riding hard, bleeding. Passed out right as you reached my property." He offered her water, which she accepted with shaking hands.
"I'm Zachariah Blackwood."
"Most folks call me Zach." She drank deeply before answering. "Charlotte. Charlotte Winters." Her voice was hoarse, but carried a musical quality that surprised him. "You've got a bullet graze, Mrs. Winters. Care to tell me how that happened?" Her eyes, which he now saw, were a warm amber rather than the brown he'd first thought darted to the window. "It's Miss. And I'd rather not say just yet." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "But I'm not bringing trouble to innocent people. I can leave as soon as I'm able." Zach frowned. "You've got a fever and a wound that needs tending. You're not going anywhere for a few days at least." A look of panic crossed her face. "I can't stay that long." She stopped herself, pressing her lips together firmly. "They'll what? Who's after you, Miss Winters?" Charlotte shook her head, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "Please, I've already said too much. I'm grateful for your help, truly, but the less you know, the safer you'll be." Zach considered her for a long moment. Everything about this situation warned him to ride into town and fetch the sheriff. But something in her eyes, a mixture of fear and determination, stopped him. "All right," he said finally. "You rest. We'll figure the rest out later." Relief softened her features. "Thank you." As she drifted back to sleep, Zach found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. 3 years of solitude had suited him just fine, or so he'd told himself. Now there was a mysterious, wounded woman in his guest room, bringing with her secrets and dangers he couldn't begin to fathom. He looked down at his hands, still stained with her blood despite his attempts to wash it away. Abigail would have known what to do. She always had a way of seeing through to the heart of matters of people. "What would you make of her, Abby?" he whispered to the empty room. No answer came, of course. Just the sound of Charlotte's labored breathing and the distant lowing of cattle from the pasture. With a sigh, Zach rose and went to prepare some broth. Whether he liked it or not, he had a guest to care for, and Blackwoods didn't shirk their responsibilities. For 3 days, Charlotte's fever raged. Zach tended to her as best he could, spooning broth between her parched lips when she was lucid enough to swallow, bathing her forehead with cool cloths when she burned too hot, and changing her bandages with hands that grew steadier with practice. Between caring for her and managing the ranch, he barely slept. His ranch hand, Miguel, cast curious glances toward the house, but knew better than to ask questions of his taciturn employer. On the fourth morning, Zach entered the guest room to find Charlotte sitting up in bed, her color much improved and her eyes clear. "You're looking better," he observed, setting down a tray with coffee and the porridge he'd prepared. "Thanks to you."
Her voice was stronger now.
"I'm not sure I deserved such kindness from a stranger." Zach shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Didn't do anything special. Just what needed doing." A small smile touched her lips.
"Nevertheless, I'm grateful.
"And I owe you an explanation." He pulled a chair closer to the bed.
I'm listening."
Charlotte took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pull on her healing wound. "I was a schoolteacher in Colorado. I came into some information evidence of corruption involving the town's mayor and several businessmen. They discovered I knew, and—"
She gestured to her side.
"They made it clear I wouldn't live to testify." "So you ran," Zach finished for her. She nodded. "I managed to secure the evidence before I fled. It's in my saddlebag. I was heading to Cheyenne to the federal marshal there. I have a friend who works in his office." Zach processed this information slowly. "Your horse and belongings are in the stable. Miguel, my ranch hand, has been looking after them." Relief washed over her face. "The evidence is safe then." "For now," Zach agreed. "But you still need time to heal before you can travel again." Charlotte's expression darkened. "I don't have time. If they've tracked me this far, they haven't," Zach interrupted. "I've been keeping watch. No strangers have passed within miles of here. You can't be sure. This is my land, Miss Winters. I know every inch of it, and I know when something's not right." His tone brooked no argument. "Besides, you try riding in your condition, you'll tear that wound open and bleed out before you reach the main road." She looked like she wanted to protest further, but seemed to recognize the truth in his words. "A few more days then," she conceded reluctantly. "But I won't put you at risk any longer than necessary." Zach nodded, satisfied with the compromise. "Now eat your porridge before it gets cold. You need your strength." As Charlotte ate, Zach found himself studying her again. In the light of day, with the fever gone from her eyes, she was striking in a way he hadn't fully appreciated before. Not conventionally beautiful, perhaps, but her face held character intelligence in her amber eyes, strength in the set of her jaw, kindness in the curve of her mouth. He looked away abruptly when she caught him staring, busying himself with adjusting the curtains to let in more light. "You live here alone?" she asked after a moment. The question, innocent as it was, hit him like a physical blow. "I do now," he answered shortly. Something in his tone must have warned her off, for she didn't press further. Instead, she changed the subject. "It's a beautiful ranch. How long have you had it?" 15 years. He turned back to face her, his expression carefully neutral. "Built it from nothing. That's impressive." Zach shrugged again. "Just hard work and stubbornness." A smile touched her lips. "I suspect there's more to it than that, Mr. Blackwood." "Zach," he corrected automatically. "Mr. Blackwood was my father, and he's been gone a long time." "Zach," then she agreed. "And please call me Charlotte." He nodded, feeling oddly formal and awkward. It had been so long since he'd engaged in simple conversation with anyone besides Miguel or the merchants in town. Words didn't come easily to him anymore, if they ever had. "I should check on the herd," he said, retreating to familiar territory. "Miguel will be nearby if you need anything. Just call out the window." Charlotte nodded, disappointment flashing briefly across her face. "Thank you again. For everything." Zach acknowledged her thanks with a slight incline of his head before leaving, closing the door softly behind him. Outside, he leaned against the wall for a moment, drawing in a deep breath. Her presence in his house stirred up memories and feelings he'd kept carefully buried. The sound of another voice in these rooms, the responsibility of caring for someone else, the simple human connection of conversation over a meal, all echoes of a life he'd once lived and lost. With a shake of his head, Zach pushed away from the wall and headed out to the stables. Work was the answer, as it always had been. Hard, physical labor that left no room for dwelling on the past or contemplating the woman who had unexpectedly entered his present. The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. Charlotte grew stronger, moving from the bed to sitting in a chair by the window, watching the ranch activities with obvious interest. Zach brought her meals and changed her bandages, their conversations gradually becoming less stilted as they grew accustomed to each other's presence. He learned she had been teaching for 10 years, that she had a brother somewhere in California, that she could name every constellation in the night sky. She played the piano, loved to read, and had an uncanny ability to predict rainfall by the smell of the air. In turn, he found himself sharing small pieces of his own life stories of particularly stubborn cattle, the time a mountain lion had stalked the property, his plans for expanding the north pasture next spring. Safe topics that required no emotional investment. But he never mentioned Abigail. Never explained the woman's clothing carefully preserved in a trunk in the attic, or why the room across from his remained closed at all times. And Charlotte, perceptive as she was, never asked directly. A week after her arrival, Zach returned from town with supplies and news that made his blood run cold. There were men asking questions, he told Charlotte as he set a package of books on the table beside her chair, a peace offering of sorts for his continued gruffness. 3 of them, well-dressed, but with eyes that didn't match their fine clothes. Charlotte's fingers, which had been reaching for the package, froze in mid-air. Did they ask about me specifically? Not by name. Said they were looking for a woman who'd stolen from them. Dark hair, about your age and build. Zach's jaw tightened. Sheriff seemed suspicious of their story, but he's putting the word out anyway. Fear washed over her face, followed quickly by resolution. I need to leave. Tonight. And go where? Zach challenged. They're watching the roads to Cheyenne. I'd bet my life on it. I can't stay here. I've already imposed too much, and now I'm putting you in danger. Zach crossed his arms. You're still healing, and I can handle myself. You don't understand what these men are capable of. I understand plenty, he interrupted. I've seen my share of desperate men, Charlotte. And I'm telling you, running now is foolish. She stood up abruptly, wincing at the movement, but holding her ground. This is my fight, not yours. I won't have your blood on my hands. Something inside Zach snapped at her words. And I won't have yours on mine. His voice was louder than he intended, echoing in the small room. I've already buried one woman. He stopped himself, turning away to hide the emotion plain on his face. A heavy silence fell between them. When Zach finally turned back, Charlotte was watching him with a mixture of surprise and understanding that cut him to the quick. I'm sorry, she said softly. I didn't know. No reason you should. His voice was rough. It was a long time ago. 3 years isn't so long, Charlotte observed gently. Zach's head snapped up. How did you? The date's on the cross on the hill, she explained. I saw it when Miguel helped me walk outside yesterday. Abigail Blackwood, beloved wife. Zach felt exposed, as if she'd peeled back layers he'd carefully constructed around his grief. That doesn't change the fact that you're in no condition to travel, he said, deliberately redirecting the conversation. Charlotte seemed to recognize his need to retreat from the personal revelation. Then, what do you suggest? I can't hide here forever. Zach considered for a moment. We need to get your evidence to the federal marshal, but in a way that doesn't put you at risk. An idea began to form in his mind. Do you trust this friend of yours in Cheyenne? Completely? With my life, she answered without hesitation. We grew up together.
Good.
Then I'll take the evidence to him. Charlotte's eyes widened. You can't. If they catch you with it, they're looking for a woman, not a weathered old rancher, Zach pointed out. I go to Cheyenne regularly for supplies. No one will think twice about seeing me on the road. You're not old, Charlotte said automatically, then flushed slightly. And it's too dangerous. These men have connections everywhere. Which is exactly why sending a letter won't work, and why you can't go yourself. Zach's mind was made up. I'll leave at first light tomorrow. It's a 2-day ride to Cheyenne. You'll stay here with Miguel. Charlotte opened her mouth to protest again, then closed it, resignation settling over her features. You're a stubborn man, Zachariah Blackwood. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. So, I've been told. That evening, Charlotte insisted on showing Zach exactly what the evidence contained so he could explain its significance to her friend. They sat at the kitchen table, heads bent close together over letters and ledgers that detailed a complex web of bribery, land theft, and even murder. The mayor and his associates have been forcing ranchers and farmers off their land, sometimes by legal means, sometimes by more direct threats, Charlotte explained, pointing to specific entries. They're building a railroad spur that will make the land values soar, but only for those in on the scheme. Zach studied the documents with a frown. And when you discovered this, I was teaching the mayor's son. He brought his father's ledger to school by mistake. Her expression darkened. When they realized what had happened, they came to my boarding house that night. I barely escaped through the window. Anger surged through Zach at the thought of armed men threatening her in the night. Your friend in Cheyenne, what's his name? William Harper. He's a clerk in the federal marshal's office. She wrote down detailed instructions for finding him. Tell him Charlotte sent you, and mention the fishing trip where I fell in the creek. It's something only he would know. Zach nodded, committing the information to memory. They worked late into the night, organizing the evidence and going over every detail until Zach was confident he could explain everything to William Harper. As they finished, Charlotte looked up at him, her amber eyes serious in the lamplight. Why are you doing this for me? You barely know me. The question caught him off guard. Why indeed? He'd spent 3 years avoiding entanglements, keeping the world at arm's length. Yet here he was, preparing to ride into potential danger for a woman who'd appeared in his life just days ago. It's the right thing to do, he said finally, knowing the answer was both true and incomplete. Charlotte studied him for a long moment, as if seeing beyond his words to the confusion beneath. Well, I'm grateful, she said simply. More than I can express. Something passed between them then, a current of understanding that made Zach acutely aware of how close they were sitting, how the lamplight caught the auburn highlights in her hair, how her fingers rested just inches from his own on the table. He stood abruptly, gathering the documents. We should get some rest. Morning comes early. If Charlotte noticed his sudden discomfort, she didn't comment on it. Good night, Zach.
And
be careful tomorrow. Always am, he replied, retreating to his room where sleep proved elusive, his mind filled with thoughts of evidence and danger and amber eyes that seemed to see too much. Dawn found Zach already in the stables, saddling his most reliable horse. He'd packed light just enough supplies for the journey, his rifle, and the precious documents hidden in a false bottom he'd created in his saddlebag overnight. Charlotte appeared in the stable doorway, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill. Despite the early hour, she looked fully alert, her hair neatly braided and her expression determined. You should be resting, Zach said, tightening the saddle cinch. I couldn't sleep. She approached, watching his preparations. Are you sure about this? Zach nodded. Miguel knows to keep watch. Stay inside as much as possible, away from windows. If anyone comes, there's a hiding place in the root cellar. Miguel showed me yesterday. She offered a small smile at his surprised look. "He's very protective of you." Said it was what Mrs. Blackwood would have wanted. Something twisted in Zach's chest at the mention of Abigail, but it wasn't the usual sharp pain. More like a dull ache, familiar but somehow changed. "Miguel talks too much," he muttered, but there was no heat in his words. Charlotte stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "Be safe, Zach." She hesitated, then continued in a rush. "I've lost too many people in my life. I couldn't bear to add you to that list, especially not because of my troubles." The warmth of her hand seeped through his shirt sleeve, and Zach found himself unable to pull away as he normally might have. "I'll be back in 5 days," he promised. 6 at the most. She nodded, withdrawing her hand reluctantly. "I'll hold you to that." With a final check of his supplies, Zach mounted his horse. He looked down at Charlotte, standing in the early morning light with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, and felt a strange reluctance to leave. "Take care of yourself," he said gruffly. "Don't let that wound get infected." "I will." "And Zach." She reached up to touch his hand one last time. "Thank you." With a nod that contained more emotion than he cared to examine, Zach turned his horse and rode out. The weight of the evidence in his saddlebag nothing compared to the weight of responsibility he felt for the woman watching him from the stable yard. The journey to Cheyenne was uneventful, for which Zach was grateful. He kept to himself, camping alone rather than stopping at waypoints where questions might be asked. By the time he reached the growing city, he was dusty and tired, but alert to any sign of the men Charlotte had described. Finding William Harper proved relatively simple. The clerk was a young man with intelligent eyes that widened in alarm when Zach mentioned Charlotte's name. "She's alive?" he asked urgently, pulling Zach into an empty office. "We heard rumors she'd been killed fleeing Colorado." "She's injured but recovering," Zach confirmed. "She said to mention a fishing trip where she fell in a creek." Relief washed over William's face. "That's Charlotte all right. Where is she now?" "Safe," Zach said, unwilling to divulge her location even to her friend. "She sent this." He produced the documents from his saddlebag. William examined the evidence with growing amazement. "This is even more comprehensive than I hoped. Names, dates, amounts, there's enough here to bring down half the government in that county." He looked up at Zach with new respect. "And you brought this all the way from wherever she's hiding just to help her?" Zach shifted uncomfortably. She needed help. Seemed the decent thing to do. A knowing look crossed William's face. "Charlotte has that effect on people. She makes you want to be your best self." He carefully gathered the documents. "I'll take these directly to Marshall Reynolds. He's been after this corruption ring for months, but lacked the evidence to move against them." "How long before it's safe for her?" Zach asked, the question that had been foremost in his mind since leaving the ranch. William considered. "With this evidence? The marshal can send telegrams today, have federal agents in Colorado by the end of the week. I'd say 2 weeks before we've rounded up all the major players." He paused. "Where can I send word when it's safe?" After a moment's consideration, Zach provided the address of the general store in Pine Ridge. "Sam Peterson will hold any telegrams for me." "Thank you for bringing this," William said earnestly. "And for helping Charlotte. She's special to many of us." Something in the young man's tone caught Zach's attention. "You two ever?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. William laughed. "No, nothing like that. She's like a sister to me. My wife would have my hide if I thought otherwise." His expression sobered. "But Charlotte deserves happiness. She's spent too much of her life fighting other people's battles." Zach merely nodded, unwilling to examine why the clerk's answer had relieved him. With his mission accomplished, Zach could have started back immediately. Instead, he found himself purchasing supplies that weren't strictly necessary: coffee of a finer quality than he usually bought, a bolt of blue calico fabric that had caught his eye in the mercantile, several books from a new bookshop on the main street. "Gift for the wife?" the bookseller asked cheerfully as she wrapped his selections. "No," Zach answered, the familiar pain twisting inside him. "Just for a friend." The woman's knowing smile made him hurry his purchase and leave, unsettled by how transparent his intentions seemed to strangers. The return journey felt longer, each mile stretching endlessly before him. Zach found himself pushing harder than was wise, camping briefly and starting again before dawn. A sense of urgency drove him, though he told himself it was merely concern for Charlotte's safety. On the fourth day, as he crested the final ridge that overlooked his ranch, Zach pulled his horse to a stop. From this vantage point, he could see the entire property: the main house, the barn, the corrals, and the small cemetery on the hill. For the first time in 3 years, his eyes didn't automatically seek out Abigail's grave. Instead, they searched the yard for any sign of Charlotte. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, his heart had begun to stir from its long slumber. The guilt came swiftly after. How could he even think of another woman when Abigail lay cold in the ground? What kind of man was he to feel this quickening of his pulse at the thought of seeing Charlotte again? His horse, sensing his distress, shifted restlessly beneath him. Zach forced himself to breathe deeply, to push aside the confusion. He had promised to return with news. That was all. This was fulfilling an obligation, nothing more. With that life firmly in place, he nudged his horse forward, down the trail toward home. As he approached the ranch house, Miguel emerged from the barn, raising a hand in greeting. There was no sign of Charlotte, and for a moment, fear gripped Zach's heart. Had something happened in his absence? "Boss," Miguel called as he drew closer. "Good timing." Was starting to worry. "Everything all right here?" Zach asked, dismounting stiffly. "No visitors?" Miguel shook his head. "Quiet as a church on Monday. The señorita is inside. She has been watching the ridge all afternoon." A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. Zach chose to ignore both the smile and the implication. "Take care of my horse, would you? He's had a hard run." "Sí, jefe." Miguel took the reins, then added casually, "The señorita made dinner. Says she was tired of my cooking." Before Zach could respond, the front door of the house opened, and Charlotte appeared on the porch. Even from this distance, he could see the relief on her face, and something inside him eased at the sight of her. She had changed into one of Abigail's old dresses, he realized as he approached, altered to fit her slightly taller frame. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, catching the golden light of late afternoon. And she was smiling, a genuine smile that transformed her face and sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "You're back," she said simply, as if those 2 words contained all the relief and welcome she couldn't express. "Told you I would be." Zach climbed the porch steps, suddenly aware of the dust of the trail on his clothes, the 4-day growth of beard on his face. "Come inside," Charlotte urged. "You must be exhausted. I've made stew, and there's hot water for washing up." The normality of it coming home to a prepared meal, to someone who had been watching for his return, caught Zach off guard. It had been so long since anyone had waited for him, cared whether he came home at all. Inside, the house felt different. Flowers from the garden brightened the table. The curtains were open wide, letting in the afternoon light. And there was a smell of fresh bread that made his stomach rumble in response. "Sit," Charlotte instructed, guiding him to a chair. "Tell me everything while I get your food." As she moved about the kitchen with surprising ease, Zach recounted his meeting with William Harper and the marshal's response to the evidence. "So, it's over?" Charlotte asked, setting a steaming bowl before him. "They'll arrest the mayor and his associates?" "According to your friend, yes. He said to expect it to take about 2 weeks to round everyone up." Zach took a spoonful of stew, making an appreciative noise at the rich flavor. "This is good." A flush of pleasure colored her cheeks. Thank you. It's the least I could do after all you've done for me. She sat across from him, watching as he ate with the hunger of a man who'd been on the trail for days. William as well. He wasn't in any danger for receiving the evidence. He seemed fine. Relieved to hear you were alive. Zach hesitated, then added, he cares for you a great deal. Something knowing flickered in Charlotte's eyes. He's like a brother to me. Has been since we were children. Zach nodded, feeling foolish for the relief that washed through him again. He said much the same. They fell into a comfortable silence as Zach finished his meal. When he finally pushed the empty bowl away with a contented sigh, Charlotte rose to clear it. I've drawn water for a bath, she said, not quite meeting his eyes. I thought you might want to wash away the trail dust. The thought of hot water was too tempting to refuse. Thank you. I appreciate all of this. In the small washroom off the kitchen, Zach found the metal tub filled with steaming water, a clean towel, and soap laid out neatly beside it. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched him deeply. As he sank into the hot water, letting it ease the aches of hard riding, Zach found his thoughts circling back to Charlotte. In just 2 weeks, she had brought light and warmth back into his home's small touches that reminded him what it was like to live rather than merely exist. And in 2 more weeks, she would leave. The thought settled like a stone in his stomach. Of course she would leave. She had a life elsewhere, a career, friends like William Harper who cared for her. What reason would she have to stay on an isolated ranch with a taciturn widower who could barely manage a conversation most days? By the time Zach emerged, clean-shaven and dressed in fresh clothes, he had firmly reminded himself of all the reasons why it was better this way. Better for her to go once it was safe. Better for him to return to the predictable rhythm of his solitary life. He found Charlotte in the sitting room, reading one of the books he'd brought back. She looked up as he entered, her smile warm and genuine. You look refreshed, she observed, closing the book. I hope the water was still hot enough. Perfect, he assured her, suddenly awkward now that his immediate needs had been met. I, brought you something. From Cheyenne. Her eyes widened in surprise. You didn't have to do that. Wanted to, he replied simply, retrieving the package from his saddlebag. Nothing special. Just thought you might like something to read besides my old farm journals. Charlotte accepted the parcel, her fingers brushing his in a way that sent an unexpected current through him. She unwrapped it carefully, her expression softening as she revealed the book's a collection of poetry, a novel by a female author gaining popularity in the East, and a book on astronomy that had caught his eye. Zach, these are wonderful. Her voice held genuine delight. How did you know I love poetry? He shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. You mentioned once that your father used to read it to you. Figured you might miss it. The fact that he had remembered such a detail, mentioned only in passing during one of their conversations, seemed to touch her deeply. Thank you, she said softly. Truly. Zach nodded, retreating to his chair by the fireplace. There's something else, he said after a moment. Fabric. Blue calico. Thought you might want something of your own to wear, instead of, he gestured vaguely at the altered dress she wore. Understanding dawned in her eyes. Instead of your wife's dresses. It wasn't a question. Abigail, Zach said, the name feeling strange on his lips after so long avoiding it. Her name was Abigail. Charlotte set the books aside carefully. Miguel told me a little about her. Said she was kind to everyone, that she made this house a home. She did. Zach stared into the empty fireplace, seeing not the cold ashes, but memories of winters past. Had a way of making everything better just by being there. Always humming or singing, always planning something, a garden, a new room, Christmas decorations in July because she couldn't wait. To his surprise, talking about Abigail didn't bring the usual crushing weight of grief. Instead, there was a bittersweet ache, painful but somehow cleaner than the festering wound he'd carried for so long. "She sounds wonderful," Charlotte said gently. "You must miss her terribly." Zach nodded, unable to find words for the complexity of his feelings. After a moment, he asked, "Have you ever lost someone? Like that, I mean." Charlotte's expression grew distant. "My parents, when I was 16. Influenza took them both within days of each other." She ran her fingers along the spine of the poetry book. "And a fiancé once. Not to death, but to war. He came back changed, unwilling or unable to be the man I'd fallen in love with." "I'm sorry," Zach said, meaning it. She offered a small smile. "Life rarely goes as we plan, does it? But we endure. We find new paths." The wisdom in her words struck him forcibly. For 3 years, he had refused to find a new path, clinging instead to the ruins of the life he'd lost. "I haven't done much enduring," he admitted. "More like existing." "Yet here you are," Charlotte pointed out, "maintaining this beautiful ranch, helping a stranger in need, risking herself to deliver evidence." Her gaze was steady, challenging him to see himself differently. "That's more than existing, Zach." He had no response to that, unaccustomed to seeing his actions through another's eyes. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell outside, the room growing dim until Charlotte lit the lamp beside her. "I should check on things outside," Zach said finally, rising from his chair. "Make sure Miguel has everything settled for the night." Charlotte nodded, reopening her book. "I'll be here." Those 3 simple words followed Zach out into the night, echoing in his mind as he made his rounds of the property. "I'll be here." Temporary as her presence was, it had already changed something fundamental in the rhythm of his days, in the very atmosphere of the home he'd shared with Abigail. As he passed the small cemetery on his way back from the far pasture, Zach found himself stopping at Abigail's grave. The wildflowers he'd placed there before Charlotte's arrival had long since withered, but someone Charlotte, he realized, had replaced them with fresh blooms. "I don't know what to do, Abby," he said quietly to the cross he'd carved with his own hands. "I never expected to feel this way again. Never wanted to." The night wind whispered through the grass, carrying no answers, but somehow easing the tightness in his chest. For the first time since her death, Zach felt not only grief at Abigail's absence, but gratitude for the time they'd had together. "I'll always love you," he promised the silent grave. "That won't ever change." But something else had changed, something he wasn't ready to name, but could no longer deny. With a final look at the cross, Zach turned and walked back toward the house, where light spilled from the windows and Charlotte waited with her book. The next 2 weeks unfolded in a rhythm that grew increasingly comfortable. Charlotte's wound healed well enough that she could move about freely, though Zach still insisted on changing the bandage himself each evening, his hands gentle as they tended to her injury. During the days, Charlotte made herself useful around the house, cooking meals that far surpassed Zach's basic fare, mending clothes that had gone too long without attention, and even helping Miguel in the garden she discovered behind the house, overgrown but still productive. Zach found himself looking forward to returning from his work on the ranch, drawn by the promise of conversation over dinner, of someone who listened when he spoke and challenged him to think beyond the boundaries he'd set for himself. In the evenings, they often sat in the parlor, Charlotte reading aloud from one of the books he'd brought her, her voice bringing the words to life in a way that made him understand why she'd been a teacher. Sometimes he would share stories of the early days on the ranch, of the challenges he and Abigail had faced in building a life here. Increasingly, he found himself able to speak of Abigail without the crushing weight of grief, remembering the joy of their life together rather than only the pain of its ending. And Charlotte listened with a gentle understanding that never bordered on pity. One evening, as a summer storm rolled across the prairie, they sat on the covered porch watching lightning illuminate the distant mountains. "I've always loved storms," Charlotte confessed, drawing her shawl closer against the cooling air. "The power of them, the way they clear the air and make everything feel new afterward. Zach nodded, understanding completely. Abigail used to say they were God's way of reminding us who's really in charge. Charlotte smiled at that. She sounds like she was very wise. She was. Zach leaned against the porch railing, watching as Charlotte's hair stirred in the wind that preceded the rain. What will you do? After it's safe to leave, I mean. The question had been weighing on him for days, but this was the first time he'd found the courage to ask it directly. Charlotte's expression grew thoughtful. I'm not sure. I can't return to teaching in Colorado, obviously. She sighed softly. Perhaps I'll try to find a position in Cheyenne or even further east. I've always wanted to see Chicago. The thought of her going so far sent an unexpected pang through Zach's chest. You'd do well wherever you go, he said, meaning it. Any school would be lucky to have you. She looked at him then, something unreadable in her amber eyes. Would you rather I went? Far away, I mean. The directness of her question caught him off guard. Why would you ask that? Because sometimes I think my presence here is difficult for you. Her gaze was steady, demanding honesty. A reminder of what you've lost. Zach turned to face her fully, suddenly needing her to understand. That's not it at all. You're not a reminder of what I've lost, Charlotte. You're. He struggled to find the right words. You're a reminder of what life can be. Should be. A flush rose to her cheeks, visible even in the dim light. And what is that? Shared, he said simply. Not just endured alone. The honesty of his answer seemed to affect her deeply. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the individual raindrops beginning to cling to her eyelashes. I've been alone a long time too, she admitted softly. Even surrounded by a classroom of children, even with friends like William. There's a difference between being around people and truly sharing your life with someone. The understanding between them in that moment was so complete, so profound, that Zach found himself reaching for her hand without conscious thought. Charlotte's fingers twined with his, warm despite the cooling air. The storm's coming closer, she observed, though neither of them moved to go inside. Yes, Zach agreed, not speaking of the weather at all. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the world, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that made Charlotte jump, breaking the spell. Laughing a little shakily, she withdrew her hand. Perhaps we should go inside before we get soaked. Zach nodded, holding the door for her as the first heavy raindrops began to fall in earnest. Inside, the house felt smaller somehow, more intimate with the storm raging outside and the two of them suddenly aware of each other in ways they had been carefully avoiding. Good night, Zach, Charlotte said, her voice soft as she moved toward the stairs. Thank you for sharing the storm with me. Good night, he replied, watching her ascend to the guest room that had, without either of them acknowledging it, become her room. Alone in the parlor, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, Zach realized with perfect clarity that he did not want Charlotte to leave when the time came. The thought of returning to his solitary existence after these weeks of shared meals, conversations, and quiet companionship was unbearable. But what right did he have to ask her to stay? What could he offer a woman like Charlotte, who deserved far more than a life on an isolated ranch with a man still learning how to live again? These questions followed him to bed, where sleep proved elusive despite his physical exhaustion. Outside, the storm gradually moved on, leaving behind a gentle rain that tapped a soothing rhythm on the roof. Eventually, Zach drifted into an uneasy slumber, dreaming of amber eyes and hands that fit perfectly in his own. The next morning dawned clear and fresh, the world washed clean by the night storm. Zach rose early as always, moving quietly through his morning routine before heading out to check for any damage from the weather. He was examining a section of fence that had been struck by lightning when Miguel rode up, his expression unusually serious. "Riders coming, Chief," he reported. "For men well armed. Coming from the direction of town." Zach's hand instinctively moved to the rifle he carried across his saddle. "How far?" "Maybe 20 minutes out. I spotted them from the north ridge." Miguel's dark eyes were concerned. "They do not look like men coming for a friendly business." Cold dread settled in Zach's stomach. "Ride back to the house. Tell Miss Winters to hide in the root cellar. Then get my shotgun from above the fireplace and meet me at the main gate." Miguel nodded once before wheeling his horse around and galloping back toward the ranch house. Zach mounted quickly, his mind racing. 4 armed men could only mean one thing: the mayor's men had found Charlotte somehow. But how? He'd been careful in Cheyenne, hadn't mentioned her location to anyone, not even William Harper. Unless they'd been following him. The thought hit him with sickening clarity. He'd been so focused on completing his mission and returning to Charlotte that he might have grown careless, might have led them right to her. By the time Zach reached the main gate that marked the entrance to Blackwood Ranch, Miguel was already there, the shotgun in his hands and determination on his face. "Is she hidden?" Zach asked urgently.
"See."
She wanted to stay and fight, but I convinced her it was better to remain unseen until we know who these men are. A hint of admiration colored Miguel's voice. Zach nodded, relieved. "Good. Let me do the talking. If things go bad, I will protect her with my life," Miguel promised, understanding the unspoken request. They didn't have to wait long. Soon, 4 riders appeared on the road, approaching at a steady pace. As they drew closer, Zach could see they were indeed well armed, with rifles and pistols visible. The man in the lead wore a badge that caught the morning sunlight. "That's Sheriff Taylor from Pine Ridge," Zach murmured to Miguel, confused. The sheriff was accompanied by 3 men Zach didn't recognize, all with the hard-eyed look of men accustomed to violence. "Mr. Blackwood," Sheriff Taylor called as they approached the gate. "Need a word with you." Zach kept his rifle ready, but not aimed directly at the men. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" Taylor gestured to his companions. "These gentlemen are from Colorado. They're looking for a fugitive, a woman who stole some valuable documents and shot a man while escaping." One of the strangers, a well-dressed man with cold eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. "We have reason to believe she might have passed this way. Perhaps even sought shelter here." Zach's expression remained impassive. "I live alone, gentlemen. Just me and my ranch hand here." "Mind if we take a look around?" the well-dressed man asked, his tone making it clear it wasn't really a question. "Just to be thorough." "Actually, I do mind," Zach replied evenly. "This is private property. Unless the sheriff has a warrant." Sheriff Taylor looked uncomfortable. "Now, Zach, no need to make this difficult. These men have traveled a long way, and they can travel right back without trespassing on my land," Zach interrupted. "You know the law, Sheriff. No warrant, no search." The well-dressed man's eyes hardened dangerously. "Mr. Blackwood, perhaps you don't understand the situation. This woman is dangerous. A thief and possibly a murderer." "Like I said," Zach repeated, "I live alone." For a tense moment, it seemed the confrontation might escalate into violence. The strangers exchanged looks, hands drifting toward weapons. Beside Zach, Miguel tensed, the shotgun ready. Then Sheriff Taylor sighed heavily. "He's right, gentlemen. I can't search his property without a warrant, and I'm not about to bend the law, even for official business from Colorado." The well-dressed man clearly wanted to argue further, but seemed to think better of it. "Very well. But we'll be staying in town for a while, Mr. Blackwood. If you happen to see this woman," he produced a crude sketch that bore only a passing resemblance to Charlotte. "I suggest you inform the sheriff immediately. She's not someone you want to harbor." Zach glanced at the sketch and handed it back. "I'll keep that in mind." With obvious reluctance, the men turned their horses and began to ride away. As they did, The well-dressed man called over his shoulder. "We'll be watching the roads, Mr. Blackwood. Just in case your memory improves." Only when the riders had disappeared from view did Zach lower his rifle, the tension draining from his shoulders. "They'll be back," he said grimly to Miguel. "With a warrant next time, or maybe without the sheriff at all." Miguel nodded in agreement. "What will we do, Chief?" "Get Charlotte out of here. Tonight." The decision crystallized in Zach's mind even as he spoke. They're watching the roads to town and Cheyenne, but not the old hunting trails through the mountains. "Those trails are dangerous," Miguel warned. "Especially at night." "More dangerous than staying here with those men coming back?" Zach was already turning his horse toward the house. "We need to prepare. Food, supplies, weapons." By the time they reached the ranch house, Charlotte had emerged from her hiding place. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes clear and determined. "I heard," she said as Zach dismounted. "They found me." "They suspect, but they don't know for certain you're here," Zach corrected, leading her inside where they could speak privately. "But they will be back, and next time they won't be stopped by legal niceties." Charlotte nodded, her practical nature asserting itself. "Then I need to leave. Immediately." "After nightfall," Zach agreed. "I know a route through the mountains. It's rough going, but it will bring you to the railway station at Silver Creek. From there, you can take the train east." "You've thought this through quickly," Charlotte observed, studying his face. "But there's something you're not telling me." Zach hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. "I'm coming with you." Surprise widened her eyes. "Such, no. You can't leave your ranch, everything you've built. Miguel can handle things for a few weeks," he interrupted. "And I'm not sending you alone into those mountains. It's too dangerous. But those men, they'll know you helped me escape. They might come after you, burn your ranch, hurt Miguel. Miguel knows how to disappear if trouble comes," Zach assured her. "He has family in Texas he's been wanting to visit anyway. And as for the ranch," he gestured around them, "it's just land and buildings, Charlotte. I can rebuild if necessary." She stared at him in disbelief. "How can you say that? This is your home, your life's work. And what kind of life would it be if I stayed safe here, knowing I'd sent you into danger alone?" Zach's voice was rough with emotion. "I couldn't live with that, Charlotte. Not, and still call myself a man." Something in his tone must have convinced her of his resolve, for she stopped arguing. Instead, she asked quietly, "What do you need me to do?" "Pack only what you absolutely need. One small bag, nothing that will slow us down." Zach was already mentally cataloging the supplies they would require. "Were the clothes I brought back from Cheyenne, they're sturdier for traveling than that dress." Charlotte nodded, practical despite the fear that must have been churning inside her. "When do we leave?" 2 hours after sunset. The moon will be up by then, enough light to navigate but not so bright as to make us easy targets. Zach reached out impulsively, squeezing her hand. "We'll get through this, Charlotte. I promise." The hours that followed were a flurry of careful preparation. Zach selected his most sure-footed horses, packed supplies that would sustain them for the 3-day journey through the mountains, and gave Miguel detailed instructions for managing the ranch in his absence. "If we're not back in 3 weeks," he told his loyal ranch hand, "sell the cattle and take your share. The deed to the property is in the lockbox under my bed. It names you as heir if anything happens to me." Miguel's eyes widened in shock.
"Jefe, no."
"You will return. Both of you." Zach clasped the younger man's shoulder. "I plan to. But life has taught me to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best." As sunset approached, tension filled the ranch house. Charlotte emerged from her room dressed in the practical clothes Zach had purchased, her hair braided tightly and a determined set to her jaw despite the worry in her eyes. "I never meant to bring this danger to your door," she said softly as they shared a last meal before departure. "You didn't choose this," Zach reminded her. The men who abused their power did. And they're the ones who should be afraid, not you. Charlotte smiled at that, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since the riders had appeared that morning. You have a way of making me believe that might actually be true. It is true. Zach leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. You stood up for what was right when it would have been easier to look away. That takes courage few people possess. A flush colored her cheeks at his praise. Thank you. For everything, Zach. Whatever happens tonight, I want you to know these weeks here have been. She paused, seeming to search for the right words. They've meant more to me than I can express. The emotion in her voice stirred something deep within him, something he'd thought long buried. Before he could respond, however, Miguel appeared in the doorway. It is time, he announced quietly. The sun is down. With a nod, Zach rose from the table. The moment for words had passed, replaced by the urgent need for action. They gathered their supplies, checking one last time that nothing essential had been forgotten. At the stable, the horses were saddled and waiting. Zach helped Charlotte mount before swinging up onto his own horse. Miguel handed him the rifle and extra ammunition. God go with you, Jeef, he said solemnly. And with you, señorita. Take care of yourself, Miguel, Charlotte replied warmly. And thank you for everything. With a final nod to his ranch hand, Zach led the way out of the stable yard, keeping to the shadows as they skirted the edge of the property. Instead of taking the main road, he guided them through a stand of pines that concealed a narrow trail, barely visible in the growing darkness. They rode in silence, both aware that sound carried far in the still night air. The moon rose, casting silvery light across the landscape and illuminating their path just enough to navigate safely. Zach set a steady pace, watchful for any sign of pursuit. It wasn't until they were several miles from the ranch, climbing steadily into the foothills, that Charlotte spoke. Do you think they'll follow us? She asked, keeping her voice low. Eventually, Zach answered honestly. But it will take them time to realize we've gone, and longer still to find our trail. By then, we'll be deep in the mountains where they won't dare follow without a guide who knows the area. And you know these mountains well? Zach nodded. Spent my first years in Wyoming trapping and hunting up here, before I had the ranch. There are paths only a handful of people know about. This seemed to reassure her, and they lapsed back into silence as the trail grew steeper and more challenging. Zach kept them moving through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and drink from a clear mountain stream. By dawn, they had climbed high enough to look back over the valley below. In the distance, the Blackwood Ranch was just visible, peaceful in the early morning light. Beautiful, Charlotte murmured, following his gaze. I can see why you love it. Zach studied the ranch that had been his home for 15 years, surprised to find that leaving it behind didn't pain him as much as he'd expected. It's just a place, he said, realizing as he spoke that he meant it. What matters is who you share it with. Charlotte's eyes, when they met his, held a warmth that had nothing to do with the rising sun. Is that what Abigail taught you? Yes, Zach admitted. Though I think I forgot it for a while after she died. And now? The question was soft, tentative. Before Zach could answer, a distant sound caught his attention. Horses, moving fast along the valley road. Squinting against the morning light, he could make out riders approaching the ranch. They're earlier than I expected, he said grimly. We need to keep moving. Charlotte cast one last look at the ranch below before turning her horse to follow Zach deeper into the mountains. The trail grew narrower, winding through dense pine forest and across rocky slopes. Zach set a careful pace, balancing the need for speed with the dangers of the difficult terrain. By midday, they had reached a high plateau where a small cabin nestled against a cliff face, nearly invisible among the trees until they were almost upon it. Trapper's cabin, Zach explained as he dismounted. Used it myself years ago. No one's likely to find us here. The cabin was dusty but sound, with a stone fireplace and rough-hewn furniture that had weathered the years surprisingly well. While Charlotte tended to the horses, Zach checked the perimeter and ensured the chimney was clear enough to risk a small fire against the mountain chill. Inside, they shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, grateful for the chance to rest after the night's hard riding. "How long will we stay here?" Charlotte asked, warming her hands by the small fire Zach had built. "Just until nightfall," he replied. "Safer to travel these mountains in daylight, but I want to put more distance between us and those men." Charlotte nodded, trust evident in her acceptance of his judgment. "Tell me about the route ahead," she requested. "So, I know what to expect." As Zach described the journey that awaited them, the narrow passes, the alpine meadows, the final descent to Silver Creek, he found himself watching the play of firelight across her features. Despite the danger, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, there was a rightness to this moment that he couldn't deny. "What?" Charlotte asked, noticing his gaze. "Just thinking that you're remarkably calm for someone being chased by armed men," Zach said, offering a smile to hide his deeper thoughts. She laughed softly. "Trust me, I'm terrified. But panic won't help us, so I'm choosing to focus on your confidence instead." "Wise decision," he agreed. "Get some rest if you can. We have a long night ahead." While Charlotte stretched out on the cabin's narrow bunk, Zach kept watch at the small window, his thoughts as restless as the clouds that scudded across the mountain sky. What would happen when they reached Silver Creek? Would Charlotte continue east alone, returning to the life she'd known before? The thought left a hollow feeling in his chest that no amount of rationalization could dispel. As evening approached, he woke her gently. They prepared to leave in the fading light, checking the horses and repacking their supplies efficiently. "Thank you," Charlotte said suddenly as they worked, "for coming with me. I know what it cost you to leave your home." Zach paused, looking at her directly. "It costs less than you might think," he admitted. "And I'm finding that some things are worth more than land or buildings." The weight of unspoken meaning hung between them as they mounted and continued their journey, following a path that wound ever higher into the mountains before beginning the long descent towards Silver Creek. The next 2 days followed a similar pattern, traveling by night when possible, resting during the day in hidden spots Zach knew from his trapping days. They spoke little during the journey itself, saving their energy for the challenging terrain, but in their brief periods of rest, a deepening understanding grew between them. Zach found himself sharing stories he hadn't told in years of his childhood in Missouri, his journey west as a young man seeking adventure, the early days of struggling to establish the ranch. Charlotte, in turn, told him of her own path, her determination to become a teacher despite her parents' deaths, her dream of someday opening a school of her own where children of all backgrounds would be welcome. "That's why the corruption in Colorado angered me so much," she explained as they shared coffee beside a small campfire on the final morning of their journey. "Those men were stealing land from families, destroying livelihoods, all to line their own pockets. The children in my classroom were suffering because their parents couldn't make ends meet, while the mayor built himself a mansion." "You could have looked away," Zach observed. "Most would have." Charlotte shook her head firmly. "Not, and still face myself in the mirror each morning." It was this innate sense of justice, this unwavering moral compass, that Zach found himself admiring more each day. Charlotte was not only brave but principled, willing to risk everything for what she believed was right. By the evening of the third day, they caught sight of Silver Creek in the valley below, its cluster of buildings glowing with lamplight against the gathering darkness. The railway station stood at the edge of town, promising connection to the wider world beyond the mountains. They made camp one last time, close enough to see the town but hidden within a stand of aspen trees. Tomorrow, Charlotte would board a train east, perhaps never to return. The knowledge sat heavily in Zach's chest as they prepared a simple meal. "We made good time," he said, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. The eastbound train comes through at noon tomorrow. Charlotte nodded, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. And then? What will you do? Head back to the ranch, I suppose. Zach poked at the fire unnecessarily. See what's left of it. I'm sorry, she said softly.
For all of this.
Don't be. His voice was firm. I made my choice, Charlotte. And I'd make the same one again. She studied him across the fire, her amber eyes reflecting the flames.
Why?
And don't say it was just the right thing to do.
There's more to it than that.
The directness of her question demanded equal honesty in return. Zach set aside the stick he'd been using to stir the fire and met her gaze steadily. Because in the weeks you've been at the ranch, I've felt more alive than I have in 3 years, he admitted. Because you reminded me there's more to life than just surviving day to day. Because. He hesitated, then pushed forward. Because the thought of you facing danger alone was unbearable. Charlotte's breath caught audibly. Zach, you don't need to say anything, he interrupted, suddenly afraid of her response. I'm not expecting anything from you. I know you have your own life, your own plans. Do I? The question was barely above a whisper. Everything I had is gone, Zach. My teaching position, my home, even my few possessions. I'm starting over completely. Hope, fragile and unexpected, stirred within him. Where will you go? Charlotte's eyes never left his. I was hoping. That is, I've been wondering if, perhaps. She took a deep breath, seeming to gather her courage. If there might be need for a teacher in Pine Ridge. The implication of her words that she might stay, might build a new life near the ranch, near him sent a surge of warmth through Zach's chest. The town's been trying to hire a proper teacher for years, he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite contain. The children make do with Mrs. Peterson's lessons 3 days a week, but she's getting on in years. And would that be acceptable to you? Charlotte asked carefully. Having me nearby? Zach stood, no longer able to maintain the distance between them. Moving around the fire, he knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. More than acceptable, he said honestly. But I need to be clear, Charlotte. My feelings for you. They're not simply friendship. Color rose in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. I know.
And I
feel the same. The admission, simple as it was, changed everything. Zach reached up, gently touching her cheek. I never thought I'd feel this way again, he confessed. After Abigail died, I was sure that part of me was buried with her. And now? Charlotte's voice was steady, but he could feel the slight tremor in her hands. Now I know I was wrong. My heart wasn't buried. It was just waiting.
For you.
The words, once spoken, lifted a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. I love you, Charlotte. I think I have since the moment you opened your eyes in my guest room and looked at me like I was worth trusting. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were accompanied by a smile of such radiant joy that Zach's breath caught. I love you too, she whispered. So much that it terrifies me. I never expected this, never expected you. The last barrier between them dissolved with those words. Zach drew her closer, his hand cradling her face, as their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. Charlotte's arms wound around his neck, her response leaving no doubt about the depth of her feelings. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Zach rested his forehead against hers. Come back with me, he said. Not to Pine Ridge, but to the ranch. Make it a home again with me. Are you asking me to marry you, Zachariah Blackwood? Charlotte's tone was teasing, but her eyes were serious. Yes, he answered without hesitation. I am. When we're sure it's safe, when those men are behind bars where they belong. I want to build a life with you, Charlotte. If you'll have me. Her answer was another kiss, this one filled with promise and certainty. Yes, she breathed against his lips.
Yes.
They spent the night planning their future together, speaking of practical matters like the school Charlotte hoped to establish, and dreams that went beyond children perhaps, extensions to the ranch house, journeys they might take together. The danger that had driven them into the mountains remained, but it no longer seemed insurmountable in the face of their shared determination. Morning found them riding into Silver Creek, alert but hopeful. At the telegraph office, Zach sent a message to William Harper in Cheyenne, informing him of their location and requesting news of the investigation. The response came swiftly. Arrests made. Mayor and associates in custody. Safe to return. Federal agents will meet you in Pine Ridge for statement. Relief washed over them both as they read the telegram. It's over, Charlotte said, her voice filled with wonder. They did it. You did it, Zach corrected, squeezing her hand. Your courage made this possible. They boarded the train not for points east but west, toward Pine Ridge and home. Seated side by side, watching the mountains give way to rolling prairie, Charlotte rested her head on Zach's shoulder. What do you think Miguel will say when we return together? She asked, a smile in her voice. Zach chuckled. Probably I told you so. He's been giving me knowing looks since the day you arrived.
He's a wise man.
Wiser than I've been, Zach admitted. It took me too long to recognize what was happening, what I was feeling. Charlotte lifted her head to look at him. We found each other exactly when we were meant to, Zach. Not a moment too soon or too late. As the train carried them homeward, Zach marveled at the truth of her words. 3 years ago, he had buried his wife and believed his heart was entombed with her. Now, against all expectations, that heart beat strong and full of purpose once more, awakened by a woman whose courage and compassion had breached walls he'd thought impenetrable. The ranch came into view as they crested the final hill, riding horses borrowed from the livery in Pine Ridge. Zach felt a surge of gratitude at the sight of the buildings standing intact, smoke rising peacefully from the chimney. Miguel emerged from the barn as they approached, his face breaking into a wide grin.
Jefe, señorita.
You have returned safely. Thanks to Zach's knowledge of the mountains, Charlotte replied warmly as they dismounted. And to you for protecting the ranch in our absence. Miguel's expression grew serious. There were men the ones from before. They returned with papers, searched everywhere. But they found nothing, of course. And they won't be back, Zach assured him, explaining about the arrests in Colorado. It's over. This is good news. Miguel's gaze moved between them, noting their clasped hands and shared smiles. And perhaps there is other good news as well? Zach exchanged a glance with Charlotte, receiving her nod of approval before turning back to his loyal ranch hand. There is. Miss Winters has agreed to become Mrs. Blackwood. Miguel's whoop of delight echoed across the yard, startling the chickens. This calls for celebration. I will prepare a special dinner. As Miguel hurried off to begin preparations, Zach turned to Charlotte. Welcome home, he said softly, drawing her close. Home, she repeated, her amber eyes bright with happiness. I like the sound of that. 2 months later, on a crisp autumn day much like the one when Charlotte had first arrived at the ranch, they stood before the preacher in the small church in Pine Ridge. The building was filled with well-wishers. Miguel and his family, who had traveled from Texas for the occasion, the Petersons and other townsfolk who had quickly grown fond of the new schoolteacher, even William Harper, who had come from Cheyenne to give the bride away. Charlotte wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her chestnut hair adorned with wildflowers. As she spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, Zach marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment, from grief to healing, from solitude to partnership, from mere existence to a life fully lived. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the preacher declared. You may kiss your bride. As their lips met to seal their vows, cheers erupted from the assembled guests. Zach held Charlotte close, overwhelmed by gratitude for this second chance at happiness he'd never thought to find. Later, As they drove back to the ranch in the wagon decorated with ribbons and flowers by the schoolchildren, Charlotte leaned against his shoulder. "Happy?" he asked, though her radiant smile had already answered the question. "Completely," she affirmed. "Though there is one more thing that would make this day perfect." "What's that?" "I'd like to visit Abigail's grave," she said gently. "To thank her in a way. For the man she helped you become, for the foundation you built together that will continue." Touched beyond words by her understanding, Zach guided the horses toward the small cemetery on the hill. There, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of gold and amber, they stood together before the cross that marked Abigail's resting place. Charlotte laid her bridal bouquet at the base of the cross. "Thank you for loving him first," she said softly, "for showing him how to open his heart. I promise to cherish him always." Zach's throat tightened with emotion. In that moment, past and present seemed to merge not in conflict but in harmony, each love distinct yet connected through the man who had been fortunate enough to experience both. "She would have liked you," he told Charlotte, his arm around her waist. "Would have been glad to know I found you." "I believe that," Charlotte replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "Love is never diminished by sharing. It only grows." As they walked back to the wagon, hand in hand in the fading light, Zach reflected on the strange, winding path that had led him to this moment. Once, he had thought his heart was buried in this hillside, gone forever with the woman he'd loved and lost. Now he understood that the capacity for love remained, enduring beyond grief, waiting only for the courage to embrace it once more. With Charlotte beside him, he had found that courage, and in doing so, had discovered not just a second chance at love, but a deeper appreciation for the woman who had taught him to love, and for the man he had become through loving her. "What are you thinking about?" Charlotte asked as they reached the wagon. Zach helped her up onto the seat before answering. "About journeys, endings, and beginnings." He climbed up beside her, taking the reins in one hand and her hand in the other. "And about how sometimes what seems like an ending is really just the pause before a new chapter begins." Charlotte's smile, warm and understanding, was all the response he needed. Together they drove toward home, not just a place but a promise, not just a building but a future they would build together, day by day, heart by heart. The heart that Zachariah Blackwood had once thought buried had instead been waiting, gathering strength for the journey ahead. And now, with Charlotte beside him, that journey stretched before them like the open prairie, vast with possibility, rich with promise, and illuminated by a love that had found him once more.